let's take a look at the Maya 2013 x64 preferences I've given you. I do have a 64-bit system, and I also have a 32-bit version from my old system. They're the 2012 preferences available from my website. You can find them by searching for them on my website. For this one, included with the training DVD, so just open that up, double click the zip file, you'll see the 2013 x64 file. I've surfed to my documents, Maya, and you can see right here is the original 2013 x64 file. I'm going to trash that. I'm going to throw it in a recycle bin. And I'm going to copy the new one, just drag and drop a copy to that folder, and it'll replace. So here's my website, and I just want to elaborate on the 32-bit preferences. You can search for the preferences underneath this link here called Tools of the Trade. And right here at the top are the My 2012 preferences, which are 32-bit. And as far as I can tell, will work just fine with Maya 2013. Back at Maya, this is what it's going to look like for us for the majority of our work. I have it set to the 4 views. I have the gray backdrop. I've changed the grid color and changed some of the colors on components. So just to give you a brief insight on how I did that, I'm going to go to Window, Settings, Preferences, and inside here I did make a couple of changes. So the for the UI elements, I did hide the time slider and the range slider, which usually live down here at the bottom. I did hide the view cube, and I've also changed under the manipulators a few things. This more or less changes how the graphic in your viewport is going to look like when you use the manipulators. So this gizmo, or the XYZ gizmo here, is the manipulators that it's referring to. The handle size I made a little bit bigger, line size, pick size is a little bit bigger, and I also have it set to highlight the manipulation handle so that when you roll your mouse over it, hover your mouse over it, it'll highlight the active handle. Underneath NURBS, I have under new curves, I have CVs checked so that when you're drawing a new NURBS curve, you can see where your CVs are as you're drawing them. And, excuse me, hit enter, and you can see them when it's selected or not selected. I find that handy in certain modeling processes. I may turn that off later on. Under the polygons, I have the vertex size set to 5. I find the actual vertex size in Maya to be challenging to select, at the least, and this makes it a bit easier for me to see and to select. Let's see, I don't think I made any other changes. Rendering, yes, here I did change the default renderer to be Mental Ray for use later on, and I think that's about it for this window. Underneath Window Settings, Preferences, Color Settings, I changed the 3D view colors, gradient top and bottom. I did change the active component, colors so that they're highlighting in red, as you can see here, and if I highlight the edge, that highlights in red. I can make the lines a little bit thicker underneath the individual viewports, and I do this once in a while to make it a little bit easier for me to see and to select. Under inactive objects, I changed the polygon surfaces, inactive NURBS, polygon and subdivision surfaces to be black, and that's how I'm able to get the black wireframe. So if I switch this to shaded and turn on wireframe unshaded for the viewport, that's how I'm able to get the black wireframe, which I find to be a bit easier to look at over a long period of time and is more reminiscent of a soft image. So as I'm bouncing between the two, my color schemes are very, very similar. So highlighting in red and non-selected in black. Underneath the polygons, this is set the polygons here, and this is also set the polygons. This drop-down menu set the polygons. And if I double-click the sphere object, I did change its default divisions to 2424. If I were to reset that, you can see it says 2020. And I also changed the grid to be a 10 by 10 grid. The cylinder, I did change the cylinder to have 8 sides instead of, I think the default is 20. Yeah, the default's 20, so I changed it to have 8 sides, which is a bit easier for us to use in most modeling practices. You notice here that on the shelf I have to simply click once for the sphere, and it brings in a sphere of specific dimensions to the origin, whereas your default Maya has this feature right here called interactive creation, and with that on, it gives me the option to drag on the grid. And this, I guess, could be nice if I wanted to draw out multiple items, but I find that this is more of a problem when I'm trying to be very precise in my modeling. So I have, over the years, lived without the interactive creation element in pretty much all programs that I'm using, or I think at least since back in 2003 when I picked up Softimage. I picked up this habit of working directly from the origin, and it made construction much easier. So I highly recommend to have that turned off. Don't get used to the interactive creation. Another preference that I overlooked was underneath the settings preferences preference, and it was right here under interface. And I turned off in main window, and I also turned off panels in the toolbar, which are these icons that sit underneath each viewport, which I think take up an awful lot of real estate. So I turned those off. And I also did turn off the mouse scroll wheel. You may want to turn that back on if you prefer to use the mouse. I'm actually using a Wacom pad and stylus. I use the old Intuos 2. So in this section we're going to take a look at the status line. The status line holds all of the most commonly used tools in Maya: selection filters, snapping filters, render settings, world transformations, things of that sort, menu sets, and that's all living right here. The menu sets, object filters, preset filters for like animation objects and polygons and NURB objects. I always leave this set to all objects. I actually never use this thing. I think you can safely ignore it. Even hit this little bar right here, click on that to hide it. These are really important here. This is your object hierarchies and your object types, and then this is your component types. This allows you to have, say, multiple objects in the scene. Here I've got a NURB sphere in the scene. I'm going to add a polygon sphere to the scene. And I've changed the viewport to shaded. That's just number 5 on your keyboard, number 4 for wireframe, number 5 for shaded. That's also sitting right here for wireframe, and number 5 for shaded. And if I switch this to all objects off, where none of these are highlighted, apparently that's new. I don't remember seeing that before. All of these objects are off, so I can't select anything in the viewports. So if I want to, say, select just the polygon objects, I can right-click this icon and choose polygon surfaces. So I can select this guy, but I can't select that one. Most of the time, it's all objects are on, and we'll get into this as the scenes get more and more complex. Really good with complex scenes. Another thing here is that these snapping icons, and what I want you to do is pay attention to these, because you're going to get stuck a lot, especially if this is your first time using Maya. What I mean by that is that these magnets should never be on all the time. You see how I've pressed that and it's highlighted as on. So that basically means that curve snapping is always going to be on. That's not something that I want. I can activate those snapping tools with the shortcuts on the keyboard: X for grid snapping, C for curve snapping, and V for vertex snapping. And I can literally just snap, say, this object to any one of the points on the sphere by holding down the V key, and I can snap to any one of these points on the sphere. Again, I'm holding down the V key. And then this fourth snapping right here, that one's very interesting. And if you leave that on all the time, it's as if you're always snapping to the view plane you're on. So orthographic views, you're always, translating in that view that you're looking at if you click at the center of the gizmo or the center of the manipulator. But when you're in the perspective view, there's 3 axes for you to manipulate on, but you may not know, exactly. You may want to move it, relative to the way you're looking at it. And so that's what this tool does, is snap to view planes. So you can snap to the view that you're looking at right now. So as I, spin this around and I drag this around, I'm actually moving it relative to the way I'm looking at the objects. So I think that's pretty useful. Similar to the tweak tool, which we'll talk about another time. And this last one is pretty darn cool. What this last one is it makes an object live. And what that means is that I could say select this sphere and click this magnet button, and notice the sphere gets highlighted in this dark green. That means it's considered live, meaning that I can then create another object, say a curve, and I can click anywhere on the surface of that sphere, and this curve will be created following that sphere. So if I just get rid of this cube here and hit number 4, notice that that spiral I just created has been snapped to the surface of the sphere. That's very, very cool. We can use that when creating polygons, appending polygons. We can use this, and I've seen students use this to snap a low poly and model a low poly version on top of a high poly version brought in from ZBrush. And this is also incredibly useful when you have to snap clothing to the body and you want to build up clothing using curves. And I'll do something similar to this when we get to the cat later on, and I want to put some kind of cloth over top of the cat's back and then maybe even throw a saddle on it, like a He-Man type cat. We'll get to that soon enough. These next 2 buttons on the status line are the selections for inputs and outputs for the cube. So for example, I have the cube selected and I want to say choose the poly cube and then go into the option box for that. I can bring up the statistics on that piece. So it's very, very, very useful. Let's say this NURB sphere, we want to take a look at the stats on that one. So it's just a quick way to get to it without having to dig around in these tabs or to dig around in the channel box, especially when it starts getting complicated. And like an output situation would be, there are no outputs to this box, but if we had, say, a curve as an example, let's make a curve. And actually, let's turn off the live. We don't need that. So let's make a curve like this. And then we had maybe a circle. Let's get a circle. And we want to then perhaps extrude that circle along that path. So, without doing anything fancy here, if we just select this surface, we can see the extrusion output, and we can see, the curve. Let's select the curve. We can see it has no inputs, but it does have an output, which is the extrusion. And the surface has the input extrusion. So and that's the same thing listed over here in the channel box, output and then input. And the circle, if we could go find that thing, the NURB circle, it has the input make NURB circle and it has the output extrusion. So it's tied to the extrusion as well because it's part of that process. So it's just something to keep in mind when you need to dig around and you have a lot of inputs and outputs. And then this third one right here is for construction history. Almost always you want this to be on, especially if you're modeling. If you turn this off, it's like having the history deleted on every single maneuver that you do. I would only turn that off if you had a terrible computer and you had terrible memory and it wasn't fast enough. But for most modern computers, I would say leave this button on all the time. And then you can control the deletion of the history by using the delete by type history right here. So you can do it manually as you go. These are your render settings. This particular one here, the fourth one on the right hand side here, this holds all of your master render settings and your render engine. So if you had V-Ray or Brazil or some other render engine, that would probably list right here, and you'd have access to all of its features. And another little known element and that I find useful is this little guy right here, where I can change between absolute transform, relative transform, renaming objects. That's useful, and selecting an object by name if you know the name of the object. And this also, these little inputs here even take little Melscript, little equations, if you will, little scripts, and that becomes handy down the road as well. Little used, little known, I think, but very, very, very useful. And then lastly, and most importantly, on the status line are these three buttons over here. This first one is your attribute editor. This is where you're going to find all the information pertaining to this particular node, this particular object, and you can find its transform node, its shape node, its modeling nodes, and its shading group and its shader. And if you deselect it, it will empty the attribute editor and reselect something else, and it will load in the attributes related to that object. You could also go here to this list button and choose to auto load selected attributes and turn that off. And what would happen then is that if I deselect this object, the attributes will stay inside the attribute editor, and if I select another object, it will not load them in. I have to load them in manually, and now I've loaded in the attributes to this particular object. So that can be handy when you need to look at a lot of information, or if you're maybe setting up some rigging, this can be handy. So normally this is set to auto load. The next one here is the tool settings. We'll be looking at this a lot. There's a great deal of information in here, and the tool settings represents for the has tools, subtools for the selection tool, move, rotate, and scale, and many other elements such as weight painting and brushes and other bits. So you can find all sorts of interesting information inside the tool settings. We'll be using that a lot. The last part of the status line is the channel box layer editor, and that's this far right hand button. And bringing a cube into the scene, you can see it populates the channel box with its pcube1, which is the name of the object. I could select that and even change the name of the object here. I have access to its translations, its rotations, and scale, and also its visibility. All of these are animatable. I also have access to its shape inputs, width, height, and depth, and subdivisions. And as I make changes to this cube, modeling changes, let's say I select a face and I extrude that face, so I go here to edit mesh and extrude it. If I make a change to that, that shows up in its history. So if I go back to object mode and take a look at its inputs again, I have here a poly extrude face where I am able to come back and make further changes to this object even after having deselected and reselected the object, and even after having turned off the tool. I still have access to all of the parameters right here in the input history. There are some limits to what can be changed. For example, now that I have extruded this object, I can't change the width, height, and depth. If I do that, you see it doesn't really know where that polygon is because I'm changing the order of and count and the number of each face. So each face starts with a particular number from the beginning of the stack, and when I selected that face and extruded it, let's say I was extruding face number 4, when I change the subdivisions width, height, and depth, I'm actually changing the location of where that fourth polygon is, and it still has the same index number. That's the word I'm looking for. It still has the same index value. I can also do basic equations inside these inputs, so I could simply type a number and move it on its translation. I could even do simple things such as minus equals 2 and move it to a value of -1. It's very handy. Rotation, I could say rotate on the y-axis 36 degrees, and if I want that to be 4 times around at 36-degree intervals, I could say times equals 4, and it gives me a value of 144 degrees. So it's very convenient, very nice. It'll take plus equals, minus equals, divide equals, multiply equals, and other simple equations that I can't think of at the top of my head right now. The channel box, you can see, depopulates, it empties when you deselect the object, and populates when you select the relevant object. So again, we'll add a sphere to the scene, and now we see all of the information relevant to the polysphere and its parameters for editing its look. I can actually reset its location by highlighting all of the translations and rotations. Click and drag, and that last number, just enter 0 and then hit enter on your keyboard, and it will change all of those values. So you can see I can change all of those values at the same time. So it's very convenient for resetting that particular object back to its original position at the origin. Scale, same thing, except scale is a 0 to 1 value, 1 being 100% of its scale. So if I wanted to change all three at the same time, I could enter a value of 0.2 or a value of 1 by highlighting all of those. Same thing when I'm editing, say, subdivisions, height and axis and height here. I could change both of those values at the same time to reduce the complexity of this polygon sphere. And same thing over here if I were to get a new cube, for example, and come over here to polycube, and I want to change the height, width, and depth all at the same time. There was another thing that I did called a virtual slider. I was doing it, and then I realized I never did say what it was. What that is that I can highlight a value, or a parameter, the word itself, not the number, but the word, and I can middle click in the viewport, and I'm holding down the middle mouse button. You can see my cursor has changed, and I'm able to change the value of the rotation on the y-axis by scrolling left and right with my mouse, holding down the middle mouse button. And I can change the speed of that scroll with this little pi icon, so I can have medium speeds, fast speeds, and very, very, very slow and refined speeds. You have this little red arrow right here, which is the difference between linear change and an exponential change based on how far you move your mouse. So it's going to exponentially increase the rate of change as you drag across the screen. I don't find that very useful. Linear works great and it's very predictable. If I need something to be non-linear, I'm going to keyframe animate it myself. Another little bit is that this little guy has to be ghosted in gray. This little gizmo right here has to be ghosted in gray in order for this virtual slider speedometer to be available. In this section I want to talk about project directories. Project directory is where you're going to hold all of your content. It's where you'd manage all of your scenes and particles and rendered images and texture references and a number of other things related to the given project that you're working on. It's very important that you manage one and maintain it and back it up. So here's how you're going to make one. You're going to go into File, under Project Window. If you have an existing project or the most recent project, it'll show up here. So I have a 3D modeling project underneath my project directories folder on my X drive. I'd like to make a new one, and I'm going to call this 3D modeling Maya, and I'm going to place it in the same location. So it's going to make a new subfolder called 3D modeling Maya underneath my project directories folder. These are going to be all the subfolders inside the 3D modeling folder. And I'm going to hit accept. To confirm this, I'm going to open up a browser, so I'm going to hit Windows E, go to my X drive, my project directories, and there it is, 3D modeling Maya, and the subfolders have been created for me. In here I have my scenes folder. This is where all of my scene content will be saved. So if I make a test scene, I have a sphere, and I'm going to do a save scene as. I'm going to make sure that the file type is ASCII so that it can be edited in a text editor. It is a slightly larger file than a binary, but it's worth it. Hard drives are big enough nowadays. I don't think you need to worry about that. And I'm just going to call this test. And again, to confirm that, I'll pop back over to my browser with an Alt Tab and check it out, and there's my file right there. To set a project directory, so if you're moving from location to location and you have the project directory on your external hard drive, and if you're in one of my courses, this is how you do it. You're going to have your project directories on your external hard drive if you're in one of my courses. And here's how you do it. Underneath File, choose Set Project, and I could easily swap between these two projects, so I could set 3D modeling to be my project and choose Set, and now all of my content can be saved there, and I can load up files and images or whatever related to that project. Again, that's File and Set Project. Pick the project and set that for the duration of your work. You could also go to File, Save Scene As, and Option Box, and in here you can set some default settings. I have set mine to always use the Maya ASCII format. There's a couple other things here. Open Scene, Option Box, where you can tell it to ignore version. I recommend that, especially if you're working from older scene files, which I will be during these lessons. And also New Scene File option box. Here's where you can set this new scene's default unit amount, degrees or radians, and the frame rate that you want to use for this particular project. So let's talk a little bit about navigation and selections and viewports and just things that you need in order to get going right away. Let's start off with selections, simple things that you've seen me do a couple of times, and I'll talk it out now. So I'm going to simply select this sphere by drawing a little marquee, and touching the sphere with the marquee will select it. And to deselect it, I simply click in a blank area. If I had more than one object in the scene, so let's bring in a cube and a cylinder, let's bring in a torus. I'm going to tap the space bar to expand the viewport that my cursor is over, and I'm going to hit number 5 on my keyboard to change the viewport to a shaded view. Now if I draw a marquee and I touch all of them with the marquee, they will be all selected, and in fact they're indexed in a particular order, or another way of saying it is that they have been collected into a collection order. I can force that particular order that they're selected, but what's really important for you to know in Maya is that the one highlighted in green is the last one in the selection. All the ones in white come before it. So Maya tends to think of it in this way, and you can see that they have a multi-selection when you see this little ... in the channel editor here after the word P torus, because it's a way for Maya to tell you that it has more than one thing in its selection there. So if I select just the torus, I can see P torus 1 here, no ellipsis, and as soon as I add the sphere to the selection, the sphere is the last one selected, so it's highlighted in green, and I do get a ... with the most recent or the last name in the channel box, and I continue to do that with each of the other objects, and you can see that you can control the order of selection one at a time, or you can not care really about the order of selection and just grab everything all at once. And again, to deselect everything, I'm going to just click and drag in a blank area of the viewport. I think you can also deselect, yeah, right here under Edit, there's the deselect right here. Okay, so navigation, let's talk about that. I've already shown you how to move from one viewport to the next. That's spacebar and then cursor over the view and spacebar. But to navigate the top view here, all I can see is the sphere. So I want to see everything. And I'm going to hit A for Apple on my keyboard. Just going to tap that. And now I can see all of the objects, and I can hit number 5 on my keyboard to see the shaded view of that. So we are seeing a true top-down view of this scene. This is exactly a 90-degree view of that scene. Spacebar again, and I can go to any of the other viewports and hit A to fit everything in the scene. Or I can just hit Shift A and it'll fit all of these objects in all of the views. I can also select one item and hit F to fit that item into the scene. So again, I can select the sphere and tap the F key, select this cube, tap the F key, and it centers the camera right around that object. And I do this all the time. It's really easy for the beginner to forget, but I think it's very, very important that you get this and practice it. The other bits of navigation I'm doing, you can see I'm rotating the view a lot, and I'm panning once in a while, and I'm dollying the camera. And that's literally holding down the Alt key while doing a middle click and drag for a panning, and a right click and drag for a dolly in and dolly out, where you're actually trucking the camera forward and trucking the camera back. And then, of course, Alt and a left click to do and drag, left click and drag to do the rotation or the orbiting of the camera around the objects. And again, if I hit A, it centers it on all the objects in the scene, and if I hit F, it centers the camera on the selection of the scene. And it would, of course, find the center of a multi-selection. So if I select 3 things and I hit F on the keyboard, it will center it at the virtual center of those 3 objects. So let's take a look at the components of any one of these objects here. So let's take the torus, for example. So I'm going to select that and hit F to frame it up. The components of this object can be accessed a couple of different ways, and the most common way is to use the radial menu. So I'm right-clicking and holding on to the object, clicking right on the object, and I get a context menu, radial menu, specific to this object type. So I can see I have edges, vertex, vertex faces, faces, a couple others, and object mode. And I've also got this common elements menu that I would use in reference to it. And this is where I can also quickly assign new materials or assign existing materials. So let's talk about faces for the moment. So I'll go to face mode. One last thing before I go further about the radial menu. It's actually a gesture menu. So you can quickly do little flicks of the wrist in object direction, edge direction, vertex direction, face direction. So you don't actually have to hold and see the menu in order to use it. It's actually a gesture menu as well. So in the beginning, you'll probably hold and see which one you're trying to get. But after using Maya for a couple of months, you'll just do little quick gestures just to get right to the component or object that you're trying to get to. Okay, so I'm going to go to face mode and make a selection. And here I have the ability to click and hold Shift and add polygons to my selection. I can hold Shift also to toggle that polygon from my selection. I can hold Control to remove from my selection completely. I can also hold Shift and Control at the same time to add to my selection. So you can see that Shift Control at the same time adds to the selection. It won't remove from the selection. And I do have a marquee for selection, so I can marquee through the entire object, which I have found to be quite handy. I think some people may find this frustrating. You might be looking for some kind of raycast method where what you click is what you get. That's available as well. That's inside the tool settings for the selection tool. So if you just come over here and double click that, you do have this camera based selection option, I have personally found it to be buggy in Maya, particularly with edge selection, so I don't use it. But occasionally I will switch to the drag, which is camera-based paint selection, and this is very similar to raycast selection in, say, Softimage, for example, which I'm very comfortable with in that program, but I'm actually sort of trained myself away from it when I'm using Maya. Same is true with edges. Let's go back to marquee, since that's the one I'm going to use most of the time. So with edges, same stuff is true. Control Shift toggles it, Control removes it, Control and Shift together adds to the selection. A very common type of selection that you're going to need regularly is going to be the edge loop selection. That's where you simply double click a single edge and it will find the loop. Excuse me, couldn't find my word there for a second. You can also get a face loop by selecting one polygon and then shift double clicking in the direction you would like the loop to go. So I could click this particular polygon and have a vertical selection, and by shift double clicking its neighbor. I can also select a range inside the loop by shift double clicking and getting the shortest range to that point. And the same with edges. I could click an edge, and then shift double click to get that range to do something to it. Same thing with vertex. So I can select this vertex. What's plural? Vertices is plural. Vertex is singular. There we go. And double click another one within a range. Same thing. And I can, like polygons, select one and then shift double click a neighbor to get the entire ring all the way around, which is the same as an edge loop. So I really don't use that very much in points, but I wanted to show it to you in case you want to use it. Another very good one is to shrink and grow the selection. So say I want to expand this edge loop selection, so I'm simply going to hit shift greater than, or that would be the period key, and shift less than to shrink it, so I can grow and shrink my selection. That's very, very, very useful when you're trying to, say, edit the digit of a character's hand and you want to simply select one finger. So you can select one polygon at the end of the finger and then grow your selection to select the entire finger, or branch for a tree or something similar. I'd like to say a little bit more about the polyloop and edge loop selections, specifically how to have more than one of those at a time. So I can select a polyloop selection by using that trick of selecting and then holding shift, double clicking its neighbor. I can get another one and yet another one. I can't quite get two of them side by side, and here's what happens. I end up getting this vertical selection because it doesn't know which one to go towards because there's already two selected at the corners. So I was thinking that it would be easiest just to go with an edge selection, an edge loop selection, and then growing that selection, which is the same as having those two parallel polyloops. There's a window that I'd like you to get familiar with very early on, and that one is the outliner. The outliner is a way to list everything that's in your scene. A quick way to get to that is this little button over here for this viewport presets. If you click on this third one here, what you get is a panel on the left hand side with the outliner embedded in it, and it gives you a full list of objects, DAG objects, available in the scene. If you were to turn off DAG, you would actually get this huge list of all these global elements that are available and nodes that are available inside of Maya, from time to the shape objects to layer objects. And most often, once in a while, beginners will accidentally hit that and turn on, or rather turn off, the DAG objects only feature. And once in a while too, you may accidentally turn on shapes, and that will show you the transformation object and the shape object. You can disable shapes so that you're only looking at the object itself. Another way to view the outliner is, I made my own shortcut for it, and this is in your preferences that I've given you. So if we go back to the 4-view setup, you can hit number 8 on your keyboard, which is actually the same as the Explorer in Softimage, same shortcut. And out of habit of using that software, so number 8 on the keyboard to bring up the outliner. I believe the default is actually Paint Effects for number 8. Again, a bit of a pain in the butt when you accidentally hit the 8 key, when you're looking for maybe just to hit the number 5 key or 7 to turn on the lights. Again, the viewport preset, or you could even set it up yourself in the viewport. So if we go back to 4-view, you can go to Panels and change any one of these views to use any one of these other menus. The top one is the outliner. You'll see me do this once in a while, where I'll set one of the views to use the outliner. You can also create simple hierarchies right here in the outliner by middle-clicking, dragging and dropping one object on top of another, and that'll make the one that you drag the child. Next up is transformations. Transformations is the way to say that we can translate, rotate, and scale the object in space. The shortcuts for that are across the top of the keyboard, the QWERTY shortcuts, which is referred to as QWERTY. Q, W, E, R, T, Y. Q for selection, W for move or translate, Y for E for rotation, and R for scale, T for the manipulator tool, and Y will repeat my last action. So Q is a great way to drop out of any existing tool. So in Softimage, for those of you who have used that program, spacebar is how you drop out of any existing tool. In Maya, Q is the shortcut that you're going to use to drop out of any existing tool, or escape depending on the tool, or enter depending on the tool. But most of the time it's Q. And that's also the same as your selection tool. W is going to bring up the translation manipulators. I call it the gizmo. This is the manipulator, and when you hover your mouse over one arrow, you can manipulate one channel at a time, or you can manipulate 2 channels at a time by holding down Control, and then I left click on the perpendicular axis, and I'm basically sliding it around on the X and Z axis. So again, I can hold down Control, click on the X axis, and now I'm sliding it around on the Y and Z axis, or the YZ plane. So here's the XZ plane, the YZ plane, the XY plane. And again, that's just holding down Control and then left clicking and dragging on that perpendicular axis. I'm going to reset these values to 0. Use my virtual slider like I've shown earlier to move it into view. Rotation. This one's just a bit more complicated, but only a wee bit. You've got Z and X and Y rotation, then you've got this extra one around, all the way around, and that's viewport or camera rotation relative to the way you're looking at the object. So you can rotate it and spin it in 2D space relative to the way the camera is looking at this object. I don't find that particularly useful. I actually will disable it, and I'll talk about that in a bit. Let's go on to scale. So scale, very similar to translation, 1 axis at a time or 2 axes at a time by holding Control, or all 3 axes at a time by clicking and dragging in the center. And again, I can reset this object by entering zeros for X translation to rotation Z, and I can enter 1 for scales. Let's take a look at the tool settings. And let's take a look at the tool settings for the selection tool. And if I minimize these little categories here, the selection tool is the simplest. It has the universal reflection and soft selection, which I won't talk about right now. We'll use those in a later lesson. The common selection options are the ones to focus on. Marquee can be set with camera-based selection. I said earlier I don't use this very much. I don't like it. It's very buggy, but it can be used. And you can marquee what you see is what you get in a sort of way. What you click is what you get sort of way. And there's also dragging. What you click is what you get. What you see in front of you is what you get. So nothing on the back end is being selected. Marquee itself, again, casts all the way through the object, and you're going to get everything all the way through. And it's very useful, particularly in an orthogonal view. So if I just tap the spacebar here and pop to another orthogonal view, and if I want to, say, select all of the vertices on the top half of the torus, you can see the marquee is a very nice way to do that from an orthogonal view, but that would actually be very challenging from a perspective view. Okay, so I want to talk about world space, local space, normals, normal average, object space. I want to talk about these things. They're very, very useful in our modeling practice and animation as well. I'm going to clear out the objects here. I'm going to select all of them and hit the delete key on my keyboard to clear out that part, clear out those objects. And I'm going to bring in, let's bring in a simple plane, polygon plane. So I'm going to simply translate this, and you can see that the gizmo is actually aligned to the directions of these bold lines here of the X and Z direction, which is relative to this little gizmo right here at the bottom left-hand side of the viewport. So my gizmo for the object is aligned to the gizmo, the manipulator icon of the bottom left-hand of the viewport. So that tells me right away that we're in world space, and I can also see I'm in world space right here in the tool settings. I'm going to hold down W on my keyboard, and I'm going to left-click and hold in the viewport. And you can see that I'm getting a radial menu with a quick access to options that are very similar to the options that live over here in the tool settings. So I'm going to switch this to object space. And notice right off the bat, nothing changes except the fact that this bullet has been highlighted next to object. Now, what I'm going to do is rotate this object on the z-axis a little bit, an arbitrary amount, and I'm going to go back to translation. And notice now that the gizmo is pointing in the direction of the rotation of the object. This is very, very, very useful. And now I can see quick, easy changes by clicking on World, and notice that the gizmo is now snapped and aligned to the world axis versus object, which is aligned to the rotation of the object itself, which is very, very, very useful. Okay, so even though local space has little to do with what we're going to model with, it really is a hierarchy and rigging issue. I would like to share it with you anyway so that you can see it in action. So here's a sphere and a plane, and I'm going to make the sphere a child of the plane by middle-clicking and dragging the sphere to the plane. And I'm going to rotate the plane, the parent, on the z-axis, and I'm going to rotate the child, the sphere, on the x-axis. And then I'm going to switch to world space so you can see that that is unchanged. Object space for the sphere is the direction the sphere is facing, and then double-clicking the tool here, going to local space, notice it's now pointing in the direction of its parent. So just evidence that local space is in fact parent space. I'd like to go on to normal and normal's average. So normal and normal average works very well when you're in a component mode. So if I select, say, one component, one polygon, and I want to manipulate that on the normal's average, what I'm going to get is the x direction as the normal for this particular polygon pointing in the direction of that polygon, and I'm able to manipulate it directly, regardless of the rotation of this object. And I could also manipulate it in world space, move it straight up and down. That's useful if I'm aligning everything to the world. And I can also align in object space, which uses the y-axis as the up direction for that particular polygon. And notice when I switch to normals average, it's the x-axis that is now the up direction. Now, what's so useful about normals average is that it will average all of the normals that I select. So let's say I select these 4 right here. So it's going to move those 4 polygons in the average direction of their normals. Their normals, and let's prove what those are. Their normals are right under here, display polygon face normals. There we go. So these little green hairs are the direction of each individual polygon. So if I were to drastically change the direction of, say, one polygon, so let's say I've got, these 3 pointing in very different directions here, but if I select those 3, what I get is the average of the 3 when I use the normals average manipulation. It's very, very useful when I'm doing organic sculpting and even industrial sculpting. It's very, very useful. And to have some understanding of what's going on under the hood really pays off to have that right here at the beginning. So again, I can switch to world, I can switch to object, I can switch to local, which is in reference to parents, and the normals average. So let's elaborate on these coordinate spaces, world and local and normals average, and use them in a couple different scenarios, and like change the center of an object or change the center of a manipulator and change the object relative to it. So I'll get a polygon plane, and I have an option here where I can rotate the pivot based on the object's pivot point. So I can say, rotate the components based on the object's pivot point. So I can say select this group of polygons here, and instead of the gizmo centering itself, which is what the default is, if I switch it to default, it would center itself on that selection. And what I want to do is rotate it around the center of the object. So if I click on object, it can kind of fold it over in that way. So I could just as easily select maybe half this object and just fold this polygon plane with this feature. I also have access to this feature if I just hold down the E key for rotation. That option sits right here in the radial menu, use component, use object pivot, and I can turn that off to get back to the default. Another way to move the component manipulator, while working with components or objects, is to hold down the D key, D for dog. So hold down the D key and you get this, I'm also holding down the Alt key to navigate at the same time. So I'm holding down D and I'm holding down Alt at the same time. And you get this yellow, and then I release Alt to move it. And I've got this green for the Y-axis, little blue here for the Z, and red for X. So I can actually change where it's going to rotate this object. Again, I can hold down the D key and literally change its location of rotation. Same thing with components. So let's trash this one, get another one. So if I go to faces here and select that again, I can actually hold down D, and then while I'm holding down D, I'm going to hold down V for vertical, V. And notice how that center right there turns to a circle? And now I can translate it forward and it snaps to the points. So now I'm taking advantage of changing the center of the manipulator and snapping to point at the same time so that I can get exactly that polygon edge to fold against. Pretty nice. Same thing here. Select that, hold down D, hold down V, snap it in place, and I can fold on that edge exactly where I need it to be. It's a very nice organic way of working, very precise way of working as well. If I get a cube here, I can change the pivot point of this cube by, let's start off with the move tool, so I'll hit W, and then I'm going to hit the home key on a Macintosh or the insert key on Windows. And that, I just tapped it, I'm not holding, I just tapped the insert key, and it turns on the very familiar looking pivot point editing icon, and it has this extra little icon right here. So what I can do is move and permanently change. I'll just arbitrarily move it here and then hit the insert key again, and now that becomes the permanent pivot point location of the cube. So if I go to rotate around that, now I can rotate that object like so. Or if I wanted to rotate the components, I could, let's say, make this a bit more specific. Hit insert, hold down the V key again for snapping to vertices, and snap to one of the corners of the cube, and hit insert again, and now I can rotate right around that corner. So you might do something like this if you wanted to maybe make a cube roll around, walk around. Don't hold me to that. I haven't actually tried it myself. But I could also go to faces and use that feature, rotate pivot around object, and now I can rotate that face around that pivot point right there on the corner. So I get this nice sort of compression and stretching going on the other end, and I'm maintaining volume, well, reasonably well on the other end. So I'd like to say just a little bit more about this changing the pivot point with the manipulator, and let's take a look at the cube again. And this time I'm going to hit W and for the translation or move tool, and I'm going to hold down the D key, and there's this icon right down here I mentioned. Well, if you click on that while you're still holding the D key, you get the rotation of the pivot. So I could permanently change the gizmo to have this orientation at every time. Now what's interesting, and I got stuck on this myself and it took me a few minutes to figure out what I had done, when you bring in a new object, it has the same rotation, and I thought to myself, what did I do now? But it's actually not that weird. What happens is if you take a look over here at the tool settings for the move tool, I'm using a custom axis for the orientation. Don't ask me to interpret these numbers right now, but it's pretty easy to reset by switching it back to world. And the custom orientation is pretty straightforward. It's the same as setting it to a point or an edge or a face, except in this case I specifically dictated which axis to rotate on. So again, if I click on that and I choose to edit this orientation, it will stay that way until I come over here and either zero it out, or I come over here and switch it to world. There we go. Zeroing it out. I clicked on world and then I clicked on custom again, and it's aligned to the world again. So 0, 0, 0 is aligned to the world. Just a little thing that I caught on to, and it kind of got me stuck for a couple of minutes, but I think it deserved a little bit of explanation.